The smoke was coming from the wrong place. Not from the rooftop. Not from a pipe rising above the eaves. From the ground. It drifted up from a low stone vent near the foundation, barely a foot off the soil, while the rest of the cabin sat quiet and still in the gray November morning. No chimney stack. No stack at all. Neighbors passing on the road stopped. Stared. A few of them laughed. One man reportedly said it was the most backward thing he had ever seen a settler build. Another asked if he was planning to heat the earthworms. The cabin looked unfinished from the outside. Modest, low-roofed, almost stubborn in the way it pressed against the hillside. Nothing about it suggested anything worth watching. But that winter, temperatures fell hard across the valley. The wind came in from a northwest and didn't let up for 3 weeks. The kind of cold that splits green wood and freezes well ropes solid before sunrise. Every other cabin in that stretch burned through its woodpile in the first month. His didn't. And every morning, without fail, when neighbors woke to frost on the inside of their window glass, he was walking around his cabin in wool socks, no fire burning, the floor warm beneath his feet. Nobody understood it. Nobody even asked the right question. Because the secret wasn't in the stove. It wasn't in the chimney or the logs or how many cords of wood he'd stacked against the south wall. The secret was in something no one thought to look at, something buried, hidden, completely invisible from the outside. This is the story of how one man understood something about heat that most builders of his era never did, and how a chimney that went down instead of up changed everything about the way a cabin stayed warm. If you've never seen this kind of system before, stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it worked and why modern construction almost never does this anymore. Subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? We read every single one. The valley he had chosen sat at roughly 2,800 feet above sea level, carved between two long ridgelines that funneled the northwest wind straight down the draw every single winter without fail. Old-timers in the region, those who had been there a generation before the settlement push, described that wind with a kind of quiet respect. Not fear exactly, more like the kind of respect a man gives to something that has already beaten him once and taught him a lesson he didn't forget. His name, as local records from that period suggest, was Elias Crane, a carpenter's son from Pennsylvania who had spent his early 20s working construction trades before following the land grants west sometime in the late 1870s. He wasn't a scholar. He hadn't studied architecture or thermodynamics in any formal sense. But he had worked with his hands long enough to understand something that most people only learn after a bad winter. That a warm house is not about the fire you light. It's about the structure that receives the heat. That distinction sounds simple now. It wasn't simple then. Most settlers arriving in that part of the country in that era built the same way. A single-room log cabin, walls chinked with whatever was available. Clay, moss, animal hair, sawdust mixed with lime. A central fireplace or a cast-iron stove positioned near the middle of the room, sometimes against the north wall. A chimney rising straight up through the roof, pulling the combustion gases out as fast as physics would allow. It was a functional system. Millions of people survived in cabins built that way. But survived is the operative word, because what those cabins could not do, what the standard frontier stove design was almost incapable of doing, was hold heat. The fire burned hot while it burned. The moment it went out, the temperature dropped. A cabin that had reached 68 degrees Fahrenheit at 8 in the evening could be sitting at 38 degrees Fahrenheit by 3 in the morning. In a winter that dropped to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside, that was not comfort. That was simply a slower version of the cold. Elias had wintered through 2 of those seasons in a conventional cabin before he started asking a different question. Not, how do I build a bigger fire, but where does the heat actually go, and why does it leave so fast? He spent that second winter watching. Not reading, not theorizing. Watching. He noticed that the stovepipe radiated tremendous heat on its way up, heat that traveled straight through the roof and disappeared into the air above the cabin. He noticed that the floor was always the coldest surface in the room, often 10 to 15 degrees colder than shoulder height, even with the stove running full. He noticed that when he pressed his hand against the stone foundation at the base of the north wall, it felt like pressing against a block of ice. The foundation was actively pulling warmth out of the structure, not holding it. These weren't revelations. They were observations. But for Elias Crane, they were the beginning of a completely different way of thinking about what a warm cabin actually required. He began to draw sketches in the margins of a land survey notebook that winter. Rough diagrams, stone layouts, channels and angles, and arrows indicating airflow. His wife, by one oral account passed down through the family, asked what he was drawing. He told her he was trying to figure out where the warmth was going. She reportedly told him to put more wood on the fire. He didn't. He kept drawing. Construction on the new cabin started in early April, when the ground had thawed enough to dig. That was the first thing people noticed. He was digging deep before he had laid a single log. Most settlers dug a shallow footer, maybe 12 to 18 inches, enough to clear the frost line and give the foundation something to sit on. Elias dug down nearly 4 feet in a wide, irregular pattern that didn't match any foundation shape the neighbors had seen before. Word got around fast in small settlements. There wasn't much else to talk about. A man named Hadley, who farmed the adjacent plot and later described the scene in a letter to his brother in Ohio, wrote that Elias's excavation looked less like a foundation and more like someone had tried to dig a root cellar and then changed their mind halfway through. It was wide in the center and narrowed toward the south wall, with a series of low stone ridges being built into the pit itself before the floor was laid. Hadley said he watched from the fence line one afternoon and could not figure out what the man was trying to accomplish. He asked. Elias gave a short answer that Hadley repeated in his letter almost verbatim. "I'm putting the heat where the cold comes from." Hadley wrote that he walked home not knowing whether to feel sorry for the man or impressed by his confidence. The laughter started in earnest when the chimney work began. Or rather, when what should have been the chimney went the wrong direction. Instead of a masonry stack rising above the roof line, Elias built a low exterior vent, barely visible above the foundation stones, positioned on the south-facing wall near ground level. It connected internally to the subfloor chamber he had been building below the cabin. His firebox, the combustion chamber where wood actually burned, sat in the basement level, dug into the hillside. From the outside, the only visible exhaust was that low, ground-level vent. No tall chimney, no rooftop stack, nothing that looked remotely like what a stove was supposed to look like. The reactions ranged from confused to openly mocking. One neighbor, according to Hadley's letters, said the whole thing would fill the cabin with smoke the first time he lit a fire. Another predicted the underground heat chamber would simply rot the floorboards within a season. A third, perhaps the most practically minded, pointed out that without a proper chimney draft, the fire wouldn't draw air correctly and would never sustain combustion at all. These were not unreasonable objections. They were, in fact, the right engineering questions. They just came from people who had never seen a system like this work, and they had no framework to imagine why it might. Elias heard all of it. He kept building. He sourced his stone from a limestone outcropping about a mile east of the property. Dense, fine-grained stone that absorbed heat slowly and released it even more slowly. He cut and laid the subfloor channel stones himself over the course of 6 weeks, shaping the internal flue geometry by hand with a mason's hammer and cold chisel. The channels ran in a specific pattern beneath the cabin floor, a long horizontal path that forced hot combustion gases to travel the entire length of the structure before exhausting, rather than escaping straight up and out as they would in a conventional chimney. By the time the cabin walls were up and the roof was on, he had roughly 2,200 pounds of dense limestone built into the subfloor system alone. None of it was visible. None of it made sense to anyone watching from the outside. And none of it would reveal its purpose until the first serious cold arrived. The summer passed, then the fall, then the wind came back down the draw. To understand what Elias Crane built beneath that cabin floor, it helps to understand where the idea came from, because he did not invent it. No single person did. What he built was an adaptation, a frontier interpretation of a heating principle that had been proven across multiple cultures and centuries long before he ever picked up a shovel. The oldest version most historians point to is the Roman hypocaust, a subfloor heating system used extensively in bathhouses and wealthy private residences throughout the empire. The word comes from the Latin for heat from below. The engineering was straightforward. A furnace outside, the building fed hot air and combustion gases into a raised floor chamber supported by small stone pillars. The floor itself, typically thick tile or stone, absorbed the heat and radiated it upward into the living space. The system worked because stone holds heat for a long time. Once the mass was warm, it stayed warm for hours after the fire went out. The Romans had figured out something fundamental. Heating a heavy floor is far more efficient than heating the air in a room. Air is light. It rises, stratifies, leaks through every gap and crack. Stone is dense. It soaks up thermal energy and gives it back slowly, evenly, without the spikes and crashes of an open fire. Across Asia, variations of the same principle evolved independently. The Korean ondol system, used for more than 2,000 years, channeled hot smoke from a kitchen fire through sealed stone flues built directly into the floor of the living space. Families slept and lived at floor level, directly on the warm stone surface. The efficiency was remarkable. A single fire in the morning could maintain comfortable floor temperatures well into the night. In northern China and parts of Manchuria, similar raised bed heating platforms called kong served the same function. In Scandinavia, the pais, a deep, massive stone fireplace, was designed not for open flame, but for thermal mass accumulation. The goal was not a bright fire, but a slow, deep, radiating warmth that the stone held long after the wood was ash. Elias Crane had encountered a version of this idea not through academic study, but through direct observation. Oral accounts from his family suggest he had spent time during his early carpentry years working on the renovation of a farmhouse in eastern Pennsylvania that still contained the remnants of a German immigrant heating system, a Kachelofen, or tile stove, adapted for American materials. The Kachelofen used a long internal flue path to extract maximum heat from combustion gases before they exhausted outside. It was made primarily of ceramic tile, which held radiant heat for 6 to 8 hours after firing. He had felt that heat. He had pressed his hand against the tile surface 4 hours after the fire went cold and found it still warm to the touch. That sensation, warmth from mass rather than warmth from flame, apparently stayed with him for years. What he built in that valley was not a copy of any one of these systems. It was a synthesis, improvised with frontier materials. Limestone instead of Roman tile, hand-cut stone channels instead of ceramic flue tiles, a hillside-dug firebox instead of a raised furnace room. The principles were the same. The execution was his own. And those principles, thermal mass, extended flue path, subfloor radiant distribution, were about to face their most important test. Standing inside the finished cabin, a visitor would have noticed nothing unusual. Log walls, roughly squared. A plank floor, slightly elevated above ground level, as was common practice for drainage. A simple cooking area near the south wall. No massive fireplace dominating the room. No cast iron stove sitting in the center with a pipe running to the ceiling. What a visitor would have seen was a low, arched stone opening set into the south wall at floor level, perhaps 18 inches high and 24 inches wide. It looked, to most eyes, like a cold air vent or a crawl space access. Not a firebox. Certainly not the primary heat source for the entire cabin. That was the point. Below the plank floor, the real architecture began. Elias had constructed what can best be described as a horizontal flue maze, a network of stone-lined channels, each roughly 10 inches wide and 12 inches tall, running in a serpentine path beneath the entire footprint of the cabin. The channels were built from the same dense limestone he had hauled from the outcropping to the east, laid with a lime mortar he mixed with fine sand for flexibility. The stone walls of the channels averaged 8 inches thick. The firebox itself was the lowest point of the system, dug into the hillside below the cabin's south wall, accessible from outside through that low arched opening. Would burn there at the base. Combustion gases, naturally buoyant from their heat, rose and entered the first channel of the subfloor maze. But instead of being allowed to rush straight up and out, the geometry of the system forced them to travel horizontally, back and forth across the length of the cabin, roughly 22 feet end to end, before reaching the exhaust vent on the north side of the foundation. By the time the gases reached the exhaust, they had surrendered most of their heat to the surrounding stone. The exhaust temperature at the ground level vent, according to a rough measurement described in Hadley's later correspondence, was noticeably cooler than what came out of a conventional chimney pipe, suggesting the system was extracting heat that a standard stove design simply threw away. The total stone mass in the subfloor system, channels, walls, and the slab-like capstone supporting the plank floor above, weighed approximately 2,200 to 2,600 pounds. That mass was the engine. Once it reached operating temperature, which took a sustained fire of 3 to 4 hours, it became a slow-release heat reservoir. The floor above it, just inch-and-a-half pine planking, offered almost no thermal resistance. Heat conducted straight through and radiated upward into the living space. Because radiant heat from a floor moves upward uniformly across the entire surface area, the temperature distribution inside the cabin was unusually even. No hot spot near the stove, no cold corner by the north wall. Oral accounts from the family describe the experience as walking on a surface that felt faintly warm underfoot, even in the deepest cold. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just quietly, persistently warm. The draft problem, the one neighbor had raised during construction, questioning whether a low-profile system could sustain combustion, was solved by the hillside placement of the firebox. The firebox sat roughly 3 feet below the cabin floor level. The exhaust vent on the north side exited at foundation height, approximately 2 feet above the firebox floor. That 4 to 5 foot vertical differential, combined with the natural temperature gradient of the system, created a consistent convective draft adequate to sustain a low, steady fire without mechanical assistance. It was not a roaring fire. It was never meant to be. The goal was not a fast, hot burn. The goal was a long, controlled combustion that charged the stone mass slowly and completely, like filling a battery rather than throwing a switch. Elias reportedly fired the system for the first time in late October, before the hard cold arrived. He burned a moderate load of seasoned oak for approximately 5 hours. Then he let the fire go out, and he waited. The floor stayed warm for 11 hours. What Elias Crane had built without a single physics textbook was, in modern terms, a radiant thermal mass heating system. The principle behind it is not complicated, but it runs directly counter to how most people instinctively think about staying warm, which is why it was so routinely dismissed and why it is still so rarely used today. Most conventional heating works by warming the air. A stove gets hot. The air near the stove gets hot. That hot air rises toward the ceiling. Because warm air is less dense than cold air and buoyancy is not negotiable, and the cold air near the floor rushes in to replace it. The stove heats that air too. It rises. The cycle continues. This process is called convective heating, and it works. But it has a fundamental inefficiency built into its physics. The warmest air in the room is always at the ceiling. The coldest air is always at the floor. A person standing in a convectively heated room is essentially living at the bottom of a temperature gradient, with their feet in the coldest zone and their head approaching the warmest. In a room heated by a conventional wood stove, the temperature at the ceiling might be 75 degrees Fahrenheit, while the temperature at floor level is 58 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of 17 degrees across the height of a single room. That differential is not just uncomfortable. It is wasteful. Every BTU that accumulates above shoulder height is a BTU that is not warming a human body. And every BTU that escapes through the roof or the high window gaps is gone permanently. Radiant floor heating inverts this dynamic entirely. When the heat source is the floor itself, when the energy is radiating upward from a warm surface rather than convecting downward from warm air, the temperature distribution reverses. The warmest zone in the room is at floor level, where people actually live. Heat rises from there through the occupied zone and reaches the ceiling already somewhat cooled. Far less total energy is needed to maintain occupant comfort, because the energy is going where the people are. In practical terms, a properly designed radiant floor system can maintain equivalent human comfort at an air temperature 3 to 5 degrees lower than a convective system. In a frontier cabin running on a finite wood pile, that difference was not trivial. Burning less wood to achieve the same warmth was the difference between making it through February and running short in January. Beyond efficiency, the thermal mass of the stone subfloor addressed a second critical problem: time lag. A conventional wood stove responds quickly. It heats fast. It also cools fast. The moment the fire dies, the thermal output begins declining almost immediately. Within 2 to 3 hours of a fire going out in a standard cast iron stove, the radiant output has dropped to near zero. Stone does not behave that way. The specific heat capacity of dense limestone, roughly 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, means that 2,400 pounds of stone heated to 130 degrees Fahrenheit contains an enormous amount of stored thermal energy. Releasing that energy back into the living space takes many hours. The stone does not know the fire is out. It continues radiating steadily, slowly, at whatever rate the temperature differential between its surface and the room air dictates. Elias Crane's subfloor system, once fully charged, retained useful heat output for between 8 and 12 hours after the fire was extinguished, depending on exterior temperature and wind conditions. A conventional stove of comparable firebox size retained useful heat for roughly 90 minutes to 2 hours. The comparison is not subtle. One system required near-continuous tending to maintain livable temperatures. The other required one good fire in the morning and, on moderate winter days, nothing more until evening. The wood consumption difference across a full winter season was estimated by Elias himself, in notes that Hadley later referenced, at roughly 40% less than his previous cabin had required. Same square footage, same climate, same family, less than half the firewood. The neighbors burning through their wood piles in January didn't know that yet. But the winter was still young. December arrived without ceremony. There was no gradual cooling, no slow easing into winter the way some years allowed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon, and by the following morning a hard crust of ice covered everything from the creek bed to the roof shingles. The skies sat low and gray over the ridgelines, the kind of sky that old settlers read like a warning. Not a storm coming, but a season settling in for a long, unbroken stay. By the second week of December, the thermometer outside the Hadley farmhouse read 4 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Wind out of the northwest cut across the valley floor at a sustained 15 miles per hour, which dropped the felt temperature well below zero. Inside the conventional log cabins along that stretch of road, families were burning wood around the clock. Not for comfort, for survival. The cast iron stoves ran hot from before sunrise until after midnight, and even then the corners of the rooms stayed cold enough to see breath. Hadley wrote in his journal that he was burning through nearly a full cord of wood every 8 days. His cabin, a single large room plus a sleeping loft, measured roughly 16 by 20 feet. The stove ran continuously. The floor was cold enough that his youngest child refused to sit on it. He had nailed extra canvas to the north-facing wall to slow the draft, and still the gap between floor temperature and stove temperature in the room measured something close to 18 degrees by his rough estimation. Across the road, the chimney that came out of the ground was doing something different. Elias Crane fired his subfloor system each morning with a load of seasoned mixed hardwood, primarily oak and hickory, split to a consistent size that fit the low firebox opening. He burned for approximately 4 hours, tending the fire to maintain a steady, moderate combustion rather than a hot blaze. Not because he lacked wood, because the system didn't need a blaze. What it needed was duration and evenness, a long, patient heat transfer into the stone mass below the floor, not a fast spike of temperature that would rush the gases through the channels before they had time to surrender their heat to the surrounding limestone. At around noon, he let the fire go out. The floor stayed warm. Not hot warm, comfortable. The kind of warmth that a bare foot registers as pleasant rather than startling. By 3 in the afternoon, with the exterior temperature still sitting at single digits and the wind pressing hard against the north wall. The living space inside the cabin registered a consistent temperature of between 61 degrees Fahrenheit and 65 degrees Fahrenheit from floor to ceiling. The temperature differential between floor level and shoulder height, which in Hadley's cabin was roughly 18 degrees, measured closer to 4 degrees in Elias's. The radiant floor was distributing heat so evenly through the occupied zone that the room felt fundamentally different in character. Not a hot spot near the stove, surrounded by cold. Just warmth everywhere, floor to ceiling, quiet and steady. At 10 o'clock that night, with no fire burning since noon, the floor was still noticeably warm underfoot. The interior temperature had dropped to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm enough to sit still in, but warm enough that a moderate evening fire for 2 hours would bring it back to comfortable levels without the frantic stoking that Hadley described in his neighboring cabin. The critical test came in the third week of January, when a true cold snap settled over the valley. Oral accounts recorded in Hadley's extended correspondence describe 3 consecutive nights where the temperature outside fell to between -14 degrees Fahrenheit and -18 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that freezes the moisture in a man's beard within minutes of stepping outside, that kills livestock left in inadequately sheltered barns, that makes the joints in green timber pop and crack like small gunshots through the night. On those 3 nights, Elias fired his system for 6 hours during the day. He used roughly a third of a cord of wood across all 3 days combined. The cabin interior never dropped below 48 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, even during the coldest hours before dawn. His family slept without waking to tend a stove. The floor, when they rose at first light, was still faintly warm beneath their feet. Hadley burned nearly half a cord across those same 3 days, tended his fire twice overnight on the worst night, and his cabin still hit 41 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 in the morning. The difference was not a matter of luck or log quality or wall thickness. It was a matter of where the heat was stored and how long it was allowed to stay. By the end of that first winter, Elias Crane had kept informal records, not scientific measurements in any rigorous sense, but practical observations written in the same land survey notebook where he had sketched his original subfloor diagrams. He recorded wood consumption by the cord, approximate interior temperatures at different times of day, and the number of times the fire required overnight tending. The records were functional rather than academic. He was not trying to prove a point to anyone. He was trying to understand his own system well enough to improve it. What those records showed was significant. Across a full heating season, from the first sustained cold in late November through the last killing frost in mid-March, a period of roughly 110 days, Elias burned approximately 6.5 cords of wood to heat his 16 by 24-foot cabin. Hadley, heating a comparable structure of 16 by 20 feet, burned between 10 and 11 cords across the same period. The difference, roughly 4 cords, or approximately 38 to 40% less fuel, represented several weeks of splitting and hauling labor, a significant reduction in the physical burden of winter maintenance, and a substantial economic difference in a settlement context where purchased wood or hired cutting was a real cost. For cords of seasoned hardwood was not an abstract savings. It was time and labor and money and margin. The temperature data told an equally clear story. Hadley's records from that winter, he had begun keeping his own after watching the contrast develop, showed his cabin averaging 57 degrees Fahrenheit during active firing hours and dropping to between 38 degrees Fahrenheit and 44 degrees Fahrenheit in the pre-dawn hours on cold nights. Peak stove-side temperature could reach 74 degrees Fahrenheit or higher during heavy firing, but that warmth was concentrated in a single zone of the room and dissipated rapidly when the fire dropped. Elias's cabin averaged between 62 degrees Fahrenheit and 66 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon hours following morning firing, and held between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit through the overnight hours without active tending, a floor-level temperature that, while not warm by modern standards, was dramatically more stable and required no midnight maintenance to sustain. The evening re-fire, a short 2-hour burn before bed, was sufficient to recharge the stone mass enough to carry comfortable temperatures through until morning on all but the most extreme nights. On moderate winter days in the 20 degrees Fahrenheit range, the morning fire alone was sufficient for the entire day. What these numbers reflect is a concept that modern building science refers to as thermal lag, the delay between when heat is added to a dense material and when that heat is released back into the surrounding environment. Dense limestone with a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit stores thermal energy in proportion to both its mass and the temperature differential between the stone and the room air. Once charged, 2,400 pounds of limestone at 125 degrees Fahrenheit represents a heat reservoir of roughly 26,000 to 28,000 BTU available for slow release, enough to maintain a meaningful temperature contribution for 8 to 12 hours under typical frontier winter conditions. A standard cast iron box stove of the period, by contrast, weighed between 150 and 300 pounds. Even at peak operating temperature, its total stored thermal mass was a fraction of the subfloor system's capacity. The moment combustion stopped, it cooled rapidly. The heat it had generated was gone. Into the room briefly, then up through the roof, through the cracks in the walls, into the cold air outside. The stone remembered the fire long after the flame was out. The cast iron forgot it almost immediately. There was one additional factor in Elias's numbers that Hadley eventually noticed and recorded with some frustration in his correspondence. The subfloor system produced no visible cold drafts. In a conventional cabin with a central stove, the combustion air the stove consumed had to come from somewhere. It came through every gap and crack in the structure, under doors, around window frames, between log courses, creating low, cold air drafts across the floor that canceled out a portion of the stove's output even while it was actively burning. The subfloor firebox, positioned outside the cabin proper and drawing combustion air directly from the exterior, did not compete with the living space for air. The cabin stayed tight. The drafts that made Hadley's floor perpetually cold were simply absent in Elias's design. It was not one advantage. It was 4 or 5 advantages, layered on top of each other, all flowing from a single architectural decision made before the first log was laid. The laughter stopped sometime in February. It did not stop all at once. It faded the way mockery usually fades, not with an announcement or an apology, but with a gradual, uncomfortable silence. The kind of quiet that settles over a group of people when the thing they dismissed has started making them look closely at their own choices. Hadley was the first to ask a direct question. He came by on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of February, when the cold had broken slightly and the temperature outside was sitting at a manageable 22 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not ask through the window or send a message. He walked up to the door, knocked, and when Elias answered, he asked if he could see the firebox. Elias took him around to the south side of the cabin and showed him the low-arched opening in the foundation. Hadley crouched down and looked inside. He asked how far back the chamber went. He asked about the channels under the floor. He asked how much stone was involved and where it had come from. He asked how long the floor stayed warm after the fire went out. Elias answered every question. He walked Hadley through the logic of the system, sketching the channel layout in the snow with a stick. He explained the draft mechanism, the firebox depth, the approximate stone mass, the reasoning behind the extended flue path. Hadley listened for a long time. Then he said, and this is recorded in his own hand in a letter to his brother dated February 14th, that he felt he had spent 2 winters working much harder than necessary, and that he was not entirely sure how to feel about that. Other neighbors followed, though not all of them were as direct as Hadley. Some came by under other pretexts to borrow a tool, to ask about spring planting, to make conversation, and found ways to steer the visit toward the cabin construction. A few asked pointed questions about the stone sourcing, the channel geometry, the firebox dimensions. One man, who had been among the loudest skeptics during construction, reportedly spent nearly 40 minutes crouching beside the south foundation wall with a hand pressed flat against the stone, feeling for warmth. He found it. 3 hours after the morning fire had gone out, the exterior stone above the subfloor channels was still radiating detectably. He pressed his palm flat against it and held it there for almost a minute without speaking. He never publicly acknowledged the conversation. But that spring, local observation suggests he began digging a wider, deeper foundation on a new structure he was planning. He did not say why. Two families attempted to replicate the system in whole or in part before the following winter. Neither succeeded fully on the first attempt. The reasons, based on what oral history and Hadley's correspondence suggest, were instructive. One builder used the wrong stone, a softer, more porous sandstone that absorbed heat, but released it too quickly to provide the sustained lag the system depended on. The other built the channel geometry incorrectly, creating a path that was too short to extract meaningful heat from the gases before they exhausted, essentially building a conventional low-draft flue rather than a thermal maze. Both men came back to Elias with questions. He answered them patiently. This pattern, the initial dismissal, the reluctant observation, the failed imitation, the return to the source, is a recurring feature of vernacular engineering history. The systems that work best are almost always the ones that are hardest to copy casually, because their effectiveness depends on a precise understanding of why each element exists. Copy the shape without understanding the principle, and you get something that looks right and performs poorly. The knowledge is not in the form. It is in the reasoning behind the form. Elias Crane never wrote a manual. He never published his diagrams or sought recognition for the design. He answered questions when they were asked, helped neighbors who came to him willing to learn, and went on living in a cabin that stayed warm through February on less wood than anyone else in the valley. That was apparently enough for him. There is a particular kind of irony in the history of building technology. The older a technique, the more likely it is to have been tested not by computer modeling or laboratory simulation, but by actual winters, seasons of real cold with real consequences, repeated across decades and generations until only the approaches that genuinely work survived. The frontier was not forgiving of elegant theories that performed badly in practice. The cold did not care about a builder's intentions or the elegance of his design. It only cared about results. Elias Crane's subfloor heating system was tested by precisely this kind of filter. It survived not because it was fashionable or economical to build or easy to explain to skeptical neighbors. It survived because it worked. Season after season, in conditions that drove conventional cabins to the edge of livability, it kept a family warm on less fuel, with less effort, and with a consistency that no cast-iron stove of the period could match. Modern construction has largely abandoned the principles behind that system, not because the principles were disproven, because the economics changed. When coal became cheap in the late 19th century, and then natural gas in the 20th, the calculus of heating shifted entirely. Fuel was no longer the scarce variable. The constraint was no longer, how do I store enough heat to last the night? Because the night could always be covered by burning more. Thermal mass, the patient, slow, expensive-to-build technology, became less interesting than a furnace that could be dialed up on demand. The insulation industry offered a different answer to heat loss. Instead of storing heat in heavy material, stop the heat from escaping in the first place. Fiberglass bats, rigid foam boards, vapor barriers, sealed envelopes. All of these targeted the same problem from the opposite direction. Build lighter, seal tighter, heat faster. This approach works. Modern well-insulated homes can be extraordinarily efficient by the metrics they are designed for. But they trade away something that the heavy mass builders understood intuitively. The difference between a house that is warm and a house that feels warm. Radiant heat from a warm surface, a floor, a masonry wall, a dense stone, warms the body directly through infrared radiation without first warming the air. It creates a quality of warmth that forced air systems, for all their efficiency on paper, have difficulty replicating. Ask anyone who has spent time in a building with a properly functioning masonry stove or radiant floor, and they will describe the experience in the same terms. Quieter, more even, more comfortable, somehow more complete. The resurgence of interest in thermal mass heating, in rocket mass heaters, in modern radiant floor systems, in passive solar design that incorporates heavy masonry, suggests that the principle did not become obsolete. It was simply set aside during a century of cheap energy, waiting for conditions to change. Those conditions are changing. Energy costs that spent decades staying manageable have become less predictable. The interest in off-grid and low-input living has moved from the fringes towards something approaching mainstream consideration. People building small structures in cold climates are asking again the question that Elias Crane was asking in that valley in the 1870s. Not how do I heat this space faster, but how do I heat it once and have it stay warm longer? The answer he found is not complicated. It requires more labor up front, more stone, more careful geometry in the construction phase. It does not lend itself to fast building or to the standardized components that make modern construction economical. It asks for patience during the build, a willingness to think about heat as something to be stored rather than something to be generated on demand. But once it is built and once the stone is warm, the results speak in the oldest possible language. A floor that holds heat through the night, a family that sleeps without tending a fire, a woodpile that outlasts the winter. Elias Crane's neighbors laughed at a chimney that went the wrong direction. They burned through their wood in January and kept their mouths shut in February. By spring, some of them were asking questions they should have asked the previous year. The lesson was not about chimneys. It was about what happens when you understand where heat actually wants to go and build accordingly. The cabin that Elias Crane built did not survive to the present day. Local records suggest it was dismantled sometime in the early 20th century, the logs salvaged for other construction as the original homestead changed hands. The subfloor stone channels, by their nature, would have been left in place, too heavy and too embedded to remove casually. If the site were excavated today, the limestone channel network he laid by hand in that hillside foundation would very likely still be there, intact, waiting under the soil. That persistence is fitting. It is, in a sense, the defining characteristic of the technology itself. Stone does not forget. The broader story of subfloor and thermal mass heating did not end with the frontier. The Korean Ondal system, which Elias had unknowingly paralleled with his limestone channels, has been in continuous residential use for more than 2,000 years and remains the standard heating method in traditional Korean architecture to this day. Modern Ondal systems use hot water pipes embedded in concrete floors. The technology updated, the principle unchanged. The Romans, who had abandoned the hypocaust with the fall of empire, left behind structures whose underfloor voids are still visible in excavations across England, Spain, Germany, and North Africa. The principle survived the civilization that invented it. What the frontier builders like Elias contributed was the improvisation layer, the proof that these ideas could be translated into available materials in remote locations by people without institutional backing or specialized knowledge, and that they would still work. The Ondal required skilled craftsmen and specific clay materials. The hypocaust required the organizational capacity of empire. Elias's version required limestone, patience, and a mason's hammer. That accessibility is what makes vernacular engineering worth studying. Not because it is romantic or nostalgic, but because it is replicable. The physics that made his floor warm in 1878 are the same physics that govern every radiant floor system installed today. The thermal behavior of dense stone has not changed. The relationship between mass, temperature differential, and heat release rate is the same calculation whether you're designing a modern passive house or laying stone channels in a hillside foundation by hand. Modern builders working on off-grid structures, of ships, and passive solar homes have rediscovered these principles through a different route. Engineering education, building science research, the accumulated literature of sustainable construction. But the destination is the same place. Heat the mass. Let the mass heat the room. Let the room stay warm long after the fire is out. The rocket mass heater movement, which gained significant momentum in off-grid building communities through the late 1990s and 2000s, is perhaps the most direct modern descendant of the thinking Elias demonstrated. These systems use an insulated combustion core to achieve extremely high burn temperatures, reducing emissions and increasing combustion efficiency, and then route the exhaust gases through a large horizontal thermal mass before venting at low temperature. The comparison to Elias's horizontal channel maze is not coincidental. It is the same insight, arrived at from different directions. What Hadley wrote in his final letter of that winter season is worth returning to. He was not a sentimental man by the evidence of his correspondence. Practical, observational, more interested in facts than reflection. But in that February letter, he wrote something that reads differently knowing what came after. He wrote that he had spent 2 winters fighting the cold and 1 winter watching a neighbor who had decided not to fight it at all, who had instead asked the cold to do the work, to move through channels of stone and leave its heat behind before it escaped. He wrote that he was not sure whether to call that wisdom or stubbornness. Then he wrote that perhaps, in the end, there was no difference between the two. The smoke that drifted up from the wrong place on that November morning, low, quiet, rising from the ground rather than the rooftop, was not evidence of a mistake or a miscalculation. It was evidence of a different question being asked. Not, how do I get the heat out, but how do I keep it in? The answer was built in limestone, laid 4 feet under the frost line, invisible to every neighbor who passed on the road and laughed. The floor remembered what the fire had done. It always does. Educational and historical content only. This script does not substitute for licensed engineering or construction guidance.